They struggled forward like animals bound for the slaughterhouse, the walls pushing in, the press of bodies hot and terrified, the children trampling one another, their bovine eyes searching for some way free. And there, amid the crush of bodies, a young girl fell to the floor. Ray saw it happen, dispassionately, the way she'd once watched a bird with a broken wing flutter across the ground. The girl lay still as feet kicked all around her. Ray watched and yet couldn't do anything, couldn't find the words to help the girl, her soul already crushed beneath the weight of everything else, already brimming full like a cup poured to the rim, unable to take another drop. Mitsue jumped out ahead of the girl, hurled himself into the maelstrom of kicking legs. When he broke to the surface, he had hold of her hand. Returning to Ray, panting, his hair a mess, the bandage on his nose loose, his gray sweater torn, he looked much the worse for wear. But when their eyes met, he offered Ray a timid smile, still pulling the little girl along behind him. It was just like him, Ray thought, to risk himself for someone else. Their entire relationship manifest in that moment. In her pocket, where she always kept it, she felt the stone cherry blossom he'd given her after her mother died, the pale pink quartz echoing her body heat. Your wish, Mitsue said out of the past, as the stone tumbled from the brown butcher paper into her palm. My wish. The tide bore them onward into the entrance hall, with its 3 massive staircases and its silver cauldron in the very center of the floor. The air here was cold and stale, as if left over from another era. Abbess Carmine pushed her way forward, drawing a slip of paper from her sleeve. Stand back, she shouted, raising it above her head. As she did, Ray noticed, smeared across the paper, sharp, bloody characters. Kindler's runes. Wadding it up, Carmine casted it into the silver cauldron. Immediately an enormous spire of flame erupted forth, reaching almost to the ceiling. The heat seared Ray's face and dazzled her eyes. For some moments she was unable to see anything. Then, as her sight returned, she saw Carmine facing them, her form outlined by the cascade of fire behind her, her face hidden in shadow. Listen up, she called over the roar of the flames. I want everyone down and asleep in 5 minutes. No one is to leave this room. If you need to go to the bathroom, you hold it. Sisters will patrol. If any of you tries to sneak out, you'll be scrubbing the floors till you're as old as I am. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Abbess, they rejoined in unison. Then what are you waiting for? She asked. Get to it. And then they were all jockeying for positions closest to the fire and laying down in a soft clatter of sound. Mitsue led them to a clear patch on the outskirts of the hall. The little girl still had hold of his hand, the firelight coppering her red hair. When he sat down, she sat next to him. Mitsue looked up at Ray, bemused. Ray sat on his other side. Her entire body felt stiff, as if she'd been running all day. She massaged the back of her neck, working the muscle fibers. Mitsue leaned close. What's going to happen now? He asked her. I don't know. How could she? The bells had rung for the first time in 100 years. We'll be lucky to make it through the night, she thought, though she said nothing of this to him. I mean, will the fire work? Will it keep? A passing sister shushed him. Mitsue waited till the sister had moved on. We'll be all right, he said, as if putting the period at the end of his former thought. We will. Ray wondered whether he was saying that for her benefit or his own. Mitsue sat back. The little girl began to cry, round tears welling up out of the corners of her eyes. We'll be all right, he said again, this time more firmly, and he patted her shoulder. What's your name? He asked her. Krista, she mumbled. Well, Krista, he said, stick with us and I promise everything will be okay. We'll look after you, and you can look after us. He pointed to himself. I'm Mitsue, by the way. Mitsue Kageda. And that mean-looking girl over there is Ray Ashford. He said all this with an enthusiasm Ray was sure he didn't feel, his hands trembling, his eyes clouded with doubt. Krista sniffled. She looked at Ray. Mitsue elbowed Ray in the chest. It's very nice to meet you, Krista, Ray managed. Why don't you lay down for a bit? Mitsue asked. Krista nodded and then lay back. Mitsue pulled off his sweater and draped it over her. She closed her eyes and in no time at all was fast asleep. As bad as this is for us, imagine what it's like for her, Mitsue ruminated quietly, brushing a stray hair behind the girl's ear. He stared into the fire. You shouldn't make promises like that, Ray said, beating her sweater flat so she could use it as a pillow. Like what? That you can't keep. And with that she threw herself down on the floor. The stone felt cool against her shoulders. She stared up at the ceiling. Mitsue lay down beside her. For a moment it was almost like they were back home, gazing up at the starry night sky, the grass in her hair, the sound of crickets. Mitsue beside her. In a minute one of the servants would call them in. They'd dress for bed. They'd knock 3 times on the wall between their rooms. Her mom had passed some time before that memory. Even so, it was a fond one. She went there now, in her mind. Her life played out before her, a line trailing through time. If only she could halt it, reverse it even. Then her mother would be alive, and her father, and she and Mitsue could lay there in the grass once more, gazing up into the still black sky of childhood, the stars burning overhead, alive and alight. My wish. She pressed her palms into her eyes. Green lights floated out on the darkness, then shriveled and were extinguished. How much longer did they have now? How many more breaths? How many heartbeats? She would be joining them soon, her mother and father, somewhere up in that black canopy of sky. Half asleep, she imagined herself falling, spiraling down towards the ceiling, weightless, insubstantial, a ghost, or shadow. Shadow. She sat up blinking. She'd seen something, she was sure of it, something moving in the gloom out beyond the firelight, something dark. She craned her head around looking for it. Silence lay over the hall, deep and impenetrable. Most of the children had surrendered to their exhaustion and now orbited some faraway dream, their breathing soft and even. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, and it, too, seemed muted. Ray scanned the edges of the hall, fear mounting in her chest. There! She swiveled her head around. She'd seen it again out of the corner of her eye. Something dark, something formless. But as she stared at the spot where it had been, she saw only the shadows of the other children bobbing in the firelight. A trick of the light. That's all it was. Her exhaustion was getting the better of her. Relax, she told herself, her heart galloping, blood squeezing into her brain. She tried to take a deep breath, but an icy pressure compressed her lungs. It's nothing, she thought, lying back. Nothing. She glanced at Mitsue. His head lay cradled against his arm, his long eyelashes pressed together. It's just your imagination. Beside Mitsue, Krista lay curled up in a ball. Just your imagination. And then she saw it. Krista's shadow bubbled, seemed to pool. From the depths rose a head, black as night, roiling on the air like coagulated smoke. Ray opened her mouth to scream, but nothing came out. 2 more heads followed, the eyes empty pits, the mouths gulping in silent horror. Limbs came next, hands, legs, arms, feet, in no discernible order, like a mass grave exhumed, the parts studded into a gelatinous excretion that swirled, that oozed, that frothed, in constant motion, changing shape and dimension and viscosity. The hands swayed and pawed at the air, the legs kicked. The whole thing shuddered as its bulk broke the plane of the floor, as if squeezed from some abortive womb. Behind it the gas lamps fluttered and died. Now free, it reared back, turning side to side, seeming to scent the air. Through Ray's fear, a thought drifted to the surface. It can't see. That was the only explanation for why it hadn't attacked yet. She knew then that the very last thing she should do was to make any noise. But her heart wouldn't stop rattling around her chest. She looked around. No one else seemed to have noticed. The sisters were all on the other side of the hall, the students all asleep, Mitsue among them. She turned her head back. That's when she saw him, a young boy, maybe 7 or 8, his eyes wide and limned with firelight. His lips struggled for purchase. Ray waved at him, tried to catch his attention. Don't make a sound. It can't see, she thought desperately. But as she watched helplessly, the boy opened his mouth and screamed. And so, too, did the Noctura.